Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Summy, and I'm coming to you this week from my home in Greensboro. um, I have a kid who I have gotten to bed, so hopefully we'll make it through this lecture this evening. Hope everybody had a great first week coming back. I know for me it was nice to be back on campus. Um, Let's see, I've really enjoyed reading everybody's biographical narratives. It's really fun to feel like I get to know you a little bit better, even if I don't get to see you, and find things that we all had in common. So this week, also, if you haven't done it, it was due yesterday. So just shoot me an email stating your case, and I will probably still let you submit it since it is just 5% of your grade. I probably will not be able to do that with papers later in the semester because there's 50 some of you and one of me, and I have two other courses. So make sure that your future papers are turned in on time. But this first week, I'll let it slide. Just shoot me an email and let me know what's up. So if you go to Files under Week 2, you will see a PowerPoint presentation that's Cold War and Entering the Atomic Age. So that's what we're going to go over this evening, or that will be your lecture for the week. And so I start with my slide 1. It's actually slide 2. So you have your introductory slide, and then I will start with slide 1 being the slide that has the first text. And slide 1 starts with the end of World War II. So in April of 1945, Adolf Hitler commits suicide, and on May 8th, 1945 is known as VE Day. It's Victory in Europe. So after the victory in the Battle of the Bulge, American, British, and French forces pressed eastward into Germany. Soviet troops came in, or pressed westward into Germany, American, British, and French forces pressed eastward into Germany, and the Russians pressed westward into Germany. And so Hitler commits suicide, and his generals, recognizing that all hope was lost, surrendered on May 7th. So in the West, the German surrender became effective on May 8th, and they signed an armistice with the Allies, being U.S., Britain, and France, and then they signed a separate surrender with the Soviet forces that became effective on May 9th. And so after VE Day, the shift of the United States and the rest of the Allies quickly refocused to defeating Germany, to defeating Japan. Sorry, I'm obviously not used to giving lectures at night. So another thing that was happening is President Truman. So on April 12th, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, and Vice President Harry Truman became president. So Truman had been vice president 82 days when FDR died, and then all of a sudden he's president. And Roosevelt had rarely contacted him, even to inform him of major decisions about the war. And the president and vice president, Roosevelt and Truman, had only met alone together twice during their time in office. So Truman knew nothing about FDR's war plans when he passed away. And particularly, he didn't know anything about the Manhattan Project, which we're going to talk about. And he considered, so there were several options before the decision to use the atomic bomb that Truman had on his plate. And remember, he kept a lot of Roosevelt's cabinet, but he was really going into this having no idea what had been the plan. So he worked with Henry Stimson, who was the U.S. Secretary of War at the time, and they considered a land invasion of Japan for November of 1945 that was going to be called Operation Olympic. And he considered these points: that Japan had no allies left, their navy was nearly destroyed, the Allied powers completely encircled Japan with Russia and the U.S. The Allies had still a lot of resources, a lot more resources than Japan. And they also felt that they had a moral superiority. Um, and so the U.S. is, considering their options as far as maybe even dropping an atomic bomb. They decided that a land invasion was ultimately going to be too costly to American lives. So they conducted a test drop, or they considered conducting a test drop with Japan watching, so that, say, okay, we're going to drop this bomb on you and destroy you if you don't surrender, and ask them to surrender. Warn Japan of an impending drop, ask them to surrender, conduct a surprise drop, and then ask them for a surrender. Don't drop the bomb and negotiate it into the war, or don't drop the bomb and invade. And once again, they decided not to invade because they were afraid they were going to lose too many more American lives. So at the Potsdam Conference, later in 1945, the participants were the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And they had gathered to decide how they were going to essentially punish the defeated Nazi Germany. Their goals of the conference also included the establishment of a post-war order, peace treaty issues, and countering the effects of war. And Truman took Stalin aside during this conference and had mentioned an unspecified, powerful new weapon. And towards the end of the conference, Japan was given an ultimatum to surrender in the name of the United States, Great Britain, and China, or, quote, meet prompt and utter destruction. But they did not mention the new bomb. So if you go on to slide 2, entering the atomic age, and you'll see about the Manhattan Project, and there's a link to the National Park Service website about the Manhattan Project. So scientists had assembled to experiment splitting the atom. And July 16th, 1945 was the first successful test of the bomb. And the science team was led by a man by the name of Robert Oppenheimer. And when the test was completed in July of 1945, he said his reaction was that, quote, "Now I become death, the destroyer of worlds," unquote. And the project was also charged with gathering intelligence on the German nuclear energy project. Germans had their own nuclear energy project. And so they selected their 2 targets. There were 3 bombs. One was a test bomb, one was the bomb they dropped on Hiroshima, and the other one was the bomb they dropped on Nagasaki. So they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and I don't even have the date in my notes. I think it was August 6th, 1945. And Hiroshima was targeted because it was the headquarters for the Japanese Army part that was responsible for Japanese Army responsible for southern Japan. And it was also a supply storage point. And this week you'll have to read some excerpts from Kessie's book, Hiroshima, about people who survived the atomic bomb, or who initially survived the drop. Hiroshima had a civilian population of about 300,000 people, and it was an important military center, as I said, and had about 43,000 soldiers. And after the bomb dropped, within minutes, 9 out of 10 people a half mile or less from ground zero were dead. Interestingly enough, Thomas Farabee, the pilot on the Enola Gay that dropped the atomic bomb over Hiroshima, was from Mocksville, North Carolina. He died in Florida in 2007. And you'll see some pictures. I'm not sure if I put pictures of Hiroshima before and after, but you can Google those, and it's really quite striking the way the bomb just completely leveled a city. And then a few days later, they dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, and it was targeted because it was a major seaport and industrial center of wartime importance. And the bomb that dropped over Hiroshima was called Little Boy, and the bomb that dropped on Nagasaki was Fat Man. And even though it exploded with a greater force, Nagasaki was surrounded by hills, and so the damage was not as great as it had been in Hiroshima. So a lot of the portions of the city were shielded from the blast. So promptly after the two bombs dropped, Japan offered to surrender on August 10th, 1945, and the emperor had to make his decision. And on September 2nd, 1945, surrender was signed in Tokyo Bay. And so there's a lot of still speculation as to why we think Truman ultimately decided to go with dropping the atomic bomb. And you have to read an excerpt from Truman's diaries this week. And so you can come to your own conclusions as well. But there were lots of things to consider. German scientists had been working on nuclear science. There was a major drive to create a bomb before the Germans did. Then ultimately the Germans surrendered. They thought that using the bomb and dropping it on Japan would shorten the war versus a land invasion, which would be costly and drawn out. And the Japanese military had kind of a different mindset when it came to battle. The Japanese fought until the last man died, or they would commit suicide if the battle was lost. So surrender was never really considered an option for a Japanese soldier. And so the Truman administration believed that a land invasion, it would just be too many lives lost, too many American lives lost to be acceptable. And there's also the idea that tensions were getting high between communist Soviet Union and the United States, and that this was also maybe a kind of like little, hey Stalin, look what we have, and a first move in the Cold War. Historians debate that. I think it was really just purely a move to end the war as quickly as possible, and I'm sure Truman wanted, as a new president, to get this war over as quickly as possible and get a win under his belt. So this brings us into officially the atomic age. No atomic bombs have been dropped since, but there was definitely the fear of that, especially for like my parents who were growing up in the 1950s and 60s, had to watch this video called Duck and Cover, which there is a link to on the slide. So I'll be interested to hear what you think about that in your comments. So going back to Europe with slide 3, the Marshall Plan. So after World War II, Europe was shattered culturally, socially, politically, economically. Laundry's done. And much of the aid of the Marshall Plan was in the form of food, fuel, and farming equipment. The Marshall Plan lasted from 1947 to 1952, during which time the United States sent about $13 billion in aid to Europe. And although all European countries were offered that aid, not all countries took it. Those countries associated with the Soviet Union did not accept the aid. It was offered to the Soviet Union and their allies, but they didn't accept it, as to do so they thought would be to allow a degree of U.S. control over their communist economy. But every participating economy's productivity surpassed pre-war levels because of the Marshall Plan. Output in 1951 was 35% higher than it was in 1938, right before the war. And the Marshall Plan was also one of the first elements of European integration, as it eased trade barriers within the countries of Europe and set up institutions to coordinate the economy on a continental level. That is, it stimulated almost a total political reconstruction of Western Europe. You see the creation of the Europe that we know today, while at this time they didn't have a common currency like the euro like they have now. We start to see them very slowly head in that direction as trade became much more free across European borders. And the Marshall Plan money was also in the form of grants that did not have to be repaid. But Europeans, in turn, spent money on American consumer goods. And you hear that the Marshall Plan is often referred to as kind of an Americanization of Europe. This is when we start to see an influx of American goods go into Europe. I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time in Europe, and it's not hard to find a place like a McDonald's or a Sheridan or very familiar things. And so we start to see these American products come into Europe as a part of the Marshall Plan. Slide 4 is a map of aid per country. And so, as I said, those in the Soviet sphere did not receive any aid. And you'll also notice that Spain did not receive any aid. Spain had a fascist dictator, Franco, and so we don't really hear much from Spain until the 70s or 80s. So that's a shout out to Spain. We're not going to talk about them again very much this semester. Also, Finland did not accept any Marshall Plan money because of their shared border with the Soviets, and they didn't want to antagonize their neighbors. And so Spain, like I said, eventually they have a fascist leader, so they didn't receive any Marshall Plan money. But fascists is the opposite of communism. They became vehemently anti-communist, and so the U.S. eases up on them a little bit later. And next week we'll talk about some of those political structures and political ideologies like communism and fascism that really structure the post-World War II world. So if you go on to slide 5, a divided Germany. So after Germany's defeat, the Allies, the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union take over governmental control of Germany. Their goal was to disarm, demilitarize, denaziize Germany and ensure that they never start another war. Because if you go back from the World War I slide this past week, you'll see that Germany was pretty much responsible for World War I as well. And so this was a big effort to make sure, Germany, you can't be starting any more world wars. So the four powers being the US, the UK, the USSR, and France. They divided Germany into 4 occupation zones for administrative purposes, and this was ratified at the Potsdam Conference. And Germany lost all of its eastern territories that it had acquired during World War II. So territories that was annexed by Germany from Austria and Czechoslovakia were returned to those countries. However, because of the divide between communism and the rest of the world, the USSR and the US and the rest of Europe, you see Germany really split into 2. So in May 1945, the Federal Republic of Germany was formed and recognized in the West. And in October of 1949, the Soviet-inspired East Germany, they formed the German Democratic Republic and became East Germany. And so we start to see this divide between what's known as the East and the West, led largely by the U.S. in the West and the USSR in the East. And the countries in the West, the U.S. and its Western European allies, form what's known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this is on slide 6. And there's also a link to the NATO website. NATO's been in the news quite a bit lately. So NATO was established as if any country in the NATO alliance was attacked, it was considered an attack against all the countries. And NATO was also, like I said, largely another part of the Americanization of Europe. The military tactics established in Western European countries were largely implemented and inspired by American military. On slide 8, on the flip side of NATO in the West, in the East, you had what was known as the Warsaw Pact. It was known as the Warsaw Treaty Organization, and it was established in 1955. And the original signatories of the Warsaw Pact were the Soviet Union, Albania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. And once again, it was considered that attack against one was going to be an attack against all. And it basically served largely the same purposes as NATO with the exception of it being in communist countries. So slide 9, the Iron Curtain. And you have a link to Winston Churchill's speech where he is the first one to use this term, the Iron Curtain. And he gave the speech on March 5th, 1946, and he was responding to Soviet actions in Europe during the immediate post-war period. And he introduced this term, the Iron Curtain, and it really symbolized the ideological conflict and the physical boundary dividing Europe into two separate areas from the end of World War in 1945 until the end of the Cold War in 1991. And the term the Iron Curtain really symbolized the efforts of the Soviet Union to block itself and its satellite states from open contact with the West and from non-Soviet controlled areas. And physically, the Iron Curtain took the form of border defenses between the countries of Europe in the middle of the continent. You also will see that there is a link to a crash course video. I use them a lot. They're fast, but there's lots of good information. And later, we'll also discuss some more about those crash course videos and how the Cold War was really an ideological battle. And so the Cold War, if you look ahead on the syllabus, the Cold War is going to be the dominant theme throughout most of the semester when we talk about the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War. Korea and Vietnam are really just considered proxy wars for this Cold War between the communist world and the capitalistic world. Next week's lecture is going to, like I said, talk about this ideological divide and kind of break down these ideologies. It might seem almost maybe a little bit more like a political science lesson than a history lesson, but it's really important to have these terms down as we go forward in the semester. So this week you also have, there will be a quiz at the end of the week. I'm going to put that up maybe tonight. I'll probably put it up tonight or tomorrow, and it will be due on Friday, and as will your readings and your discussion posts. I did have some questions. Yes, all of Animal Farm is due in a couple weeks, so like I said, go on and get started on that. It's not a very long book. Hopefully some of y'all have read it, even if it's been a long time. I think probably a lot of you hopefully have read it in high school, but my mom's a lit teacher, so I like to use literature in my history books, and it's a really great book that frames a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about between the East and the West during the 20th century. I think that's it. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, and looking forward to seeing your discussion posts. I'll put up a discussion post, like I said, again, probably tonight or tomorrow. It'll probably be tomorrow. So I'll put up a discussion board post, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this week's reading and presentation. Hope you have a great week, and I'll see y'all later.